In today's video, we're going to cover the elemental plane of air, one of the 4 elemental planes within the cosmology of D&D. I'll be discussing the other 3 planes, earth, fire and water, in subsequent videos, making this a 4-part series. In each video, I'll tell you how your players can enter the plane, cover the essential lore, and explain what and who you'll find there. I'll also offer specific tips for running these unique settings in your own games. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that I have a Kickstarter launching later this fall. It's a campaign setting called Wildergrove, in which your players take on the roles of anthropomorphic woodland animals in a world of muskets, airships, and trichron hats. The 200-page setting guide includes new animal races, detailed lore and locations, rules for airship combat, and a wealth of unique player options, from subclasses and background mechanics to an overhauled alignment system. The final release will be digital, allowing me to put most of the money into paying for illustrators, but all backers get a print-friendly version as well. If you want to get notified when we go live, follow the link below this video. For anyone who is new to the lore of 5e D&D, the game uses what's called the Great Wheel cosmology. This is essentially a way of laying out and relating all the different worlds and dimensions of the game. All you need to know for this video is that most D&D games take place in the material plane, which is essentially just the physical world, and is surrounded by the 4 elemental planes, each one infinite in size. The core element of each plane bleeds into the material plane, providing the world with air, earth, fire, and water. Because of how interlinked the elemental planes are with the material plane, it's relatively straightforward to travel between them. The simplest option is to use a spell like Plane Shift, or to create some kind of temporary magical portal. However, gateways into the elemental planes can also occur naturally in areas of the material plane where the power of a particular element is intensified. For example, during a hurricane, creatures caught in a vortex of wind might find themselves drawn into the elemental plane of air. Remember, the material plane is surrounded on all sides by the elemental planes, and things like oceans, mountains, storms, and volcanoes result from the elemental planes interfacing with the material plane. If a player is caught in a storm or flying high amid the clouds, it's possible for them to just slip into the elemental plane of air by accident. Some creatures who live in the material plane might know intuitively how to reach a certain elemental plane. For example, an Aarakocra, being a creature of the air, could instinctively sense that a certain wind current, if followed, would lead them into the plane of air. The elemental planes also overlap with each other, and their borders are pretty porous. For example, the plane of air sits between the planes of fire and water, so once you're in one of these planes, you can physically travel to another by crossing the overlapping hinterlands between them. We'll discuss how they overlap later in this video. First, let's take a closer look at the plane of air itself. The elemental plane of air is a vast region of open sky filled with clouds, constant wind currents, and floating islands known as earth motes. The vast majority of the plane is just air and cloud. There's no land to speak of, aside from occasional floating rocks. It's an infinite blue sky stretching away on every side. Now, throughout the sky are countless winds, all moving at different speeds to create a maze of air currents, known collectively as the labyrinth winds. When your players visit the plane of air, they'll probably be using some kind of airship, which will sail along specific routes within the labyrinth winds. If you want to create a regional map of the plane, you can draw out lines to represent the largest and most powerful wind flows, and your players can use these as highways, making navigation a bit more manageable. Some of the winds blowing through the plane are dangerously powerful, however, and will tear apart creatures and aerial vessels that attempt to sail them. Don't make the mistake of imagining that the plane of air is a peaceful, ethereal place. Huge storms and tornadoes often threaten its inhabitants, and in some areas, dense cloud cover creates regions of rain-swept darkness, pockets of night within the blue sky. Weather in the plane of air serves to create natural barriers around certain locations, which can only be reached by following incredibly specific and dangerous winds or passing through deadly storm clouds. From a practical point of view, this can be incredibly useful if you're running adventures here, because it gives you a lore-friendly way to gate off particularly dangerous areas of the map when your players are at lower levels. Maybe to reach an endgame quest location, they first need to upgrade their airship enough for it to travel through a high-risk region of the labyrinth winds. All forms of weather can be found here, from freezing blizzards to deadly firestorms, but that doesn't deter the many creatures who call this plane home. Let's talk about them next. The plane of air is filled with life. Bestial birds, aarakocra, and other flying creatures make their homes here. Dragons sometimes soar amid the clouds alongside air elementals who are native to the plane. These air elementals are pure embodiments of their element, with virtually no sense of consciousness or intention. Left to their own devices, they swirl through the winds and go happily upon their way, paying little attention to each other or to anyone else. When players encounter more intentional, potentially aggressive air elementals like invisible stalkers, these creatures have usually been summoned by a spellcaster and bound with magic. That gives them a greater level of personal definition and purpose than they naturally possess. Creatures who cannot fly or who need to rest between flights usually make their homes on the larger earth motes, on floating icebergs, or on magically solid clouds. One notable example of this is the great city of Akka, home of the Vati and ruled over by the Wind Dukes. The Vati are a mysterious people, described as being tall, with black skin and vaguely angelic appearance. They might be immortal. At the very least, they live for thousands of years, and only one or two new Vati are born every few centuries. They live in deep seclusion. Their earth mote can only be found by following a very specific route through the Labyrinth Winds, a route known only to a few. In the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, the wording implies that the Wind Dukes might not be Vati themselves, but in previous editions the Wind Dukes seem to just be high-ranking Vati, which is the version I go with. The Vati have powerful magic, so much so that some warlocks have been known to rely on them as patrons, and they played a major role in the lore of previous editions. At one time, the Wind Dukes ruled over a much larger empire and ended up playing a big role in the Dawn War. While we don't have time to get into the Dawn War today, it's worth noting that the Vati helped to end that conflict. Gods and primordials were engaged in a devastating war, and the Vati created an artifact called the Rod of Law, better known as the Rod of 7 Parts. This item was eventually used to defeat Miska the Wolf Spider, a demon prince who was leading the primordials. While the lore of D&D changes from one edition to the next, I like to imagine that most of the Vati were destroyed during the Dawn War, and that those who remain in Akka today are the last remnants of this once great empire. Far more numerous in the plane of air than the Vati are the Jinn. Now for reference, Jinn is the plural of genie, with a DJ, but a genie with a DJ is a type of genie with a G. There are different types of genie with a G in all the elemental planes, and the Jinn, DJ, are the ones we find in the plane of air. Jinn are elementals with a humanoid appearance, blue skin, and an aesthetic that we would associate with the architecture, clothing, and terminology of the Islamic Golden Age. Jinn society is spread across a number of freeholds, floating settlements that all answer to a caliph in the great citadel of ice and steel, the Jinn power center. If you're looking for a race to use as the base population group for the plane of air, the equivalent of humans in the material plane or Eladrin in the Feywild, the Jinn are a good bet. They allow you to include stores, markets, guards, nobles, and politics, all the things players will recognise as being part of a fantasy world. Of course, not everyone in the plane of air is as humanoid and benign as the Vati or the Jinn. You're going to want monsters for your players to fight, and most of these are going to be winged creatures. I like to imagine that most flying monsters, dragons, rocks, quattles, griffins, can be found here, having flown through from the material plane. I'd also throw in some air-breathing equivalents for giant underwater monsters, a flying kraken that dwells amid the storm clouds, for example, or airborne sharks. Your players will often be sailing in airships with sails and cannons, so a giant flying squid won't feel too out of place. Now, we've already referenced a few locations in the plane of air, like Akka and the Citadel of Ice and Steel. So let's go deeper on these specific landmarks, the places your players will find in this setting. Let's return to the Citadel of Ice and Steel. This is the heart of Jinn society in the plane of air, a huge lump of rock and ice with the Caliph's palace carved out at its centre. I like to imagine that the ice rock's exterior is covered in buildings, but that the further under its surface you go, the more grand and beautiful it becomes. High-status Jinn would live nearer the centre because it's closer to the palace, while those lower in the social order would live nearer to or on the surface. Jinn can fly and hover, so the Citadel of Ice and Steel is built with the assumption that people traversing its streets and passages are not doing so on foot. Consequently, there are no stairs, and outsiders are likely to struggle if they attempt to get closer to the palatial centre of the ice rock. The Caliph, who rules the Citadel of Ice and Steel, commands considerable military power. The Jinn army is split up into 4 sections, which we'll cover very quickly. The Teeth of the Wind make up the bulk of the military, with tens of thousands of elementals, mercenary, Jinn and Jann. Jann are like Jinn, but they're a bit weaker and a bit further down the Jinn social order. Jinn commoners, basically. The Azir Legion is made up of about 10,000 Jann, with a focus on ranged attacks, including spears, arrows, and some lightning spells. The Monsoon Legion is a group of 1,000 Jinn warriors who act as the bodyguard to the Great Caliph. And finally we have the Silver Turban Legion, a cohort of just a few hundred elite female fighters who all ride griffins. Now, unlike the Citadel of Ice and Steel and the Vati city-state of Akka, some notable landmarks and regions in the plane of air are naturally occurring, the results of the overlap between the elemental planes. Fly towards the plane of water and you'll find 2 notable landmarks. The first is the Mistral Reach, an area of sky filled with snowstorms and bitter winds. Earth motes here are crusted with snow and ice, and floating icebergs pose almost as much of a threat to ships as hungry white dragons. Despite how dangerous this area is, Jinn, Jann and others visit the region to mine ice. That's because of the Frostfell, a vast glacier that marks the overlap between the planes of air and water. The ice chiseled from this glacier does not melt and is used in Jinn construction projects, so it holds great value. On the opposite side of the plane of air, your players can find the Sirocco Straits, a region of inhospitably hot, dry sky. Fire is carried on the wind, and red dragons can sometimes be found here, having emerged from the plane of fire to hunt in the plane of air. Beyond the Sirocco Straits is the Great Conflagration, a mighty firestorm born out of the restless marriage of air and fire. The result of the Great Conflagration is an enormous amount of ash. Players flying through this region must be wary of inhaling the toxic ashen air and will really struggle with visibility. Despite the hostile environment, this is not a lifeless area. Some of the ash forms into clumps like grey earth motes, where small lawless communities take root. This is just a suggestion, but I think it would be fantastic to run a Wild West flavoured campaign with bandits and outlaws living in a Deadwood-style frontier town on an ash mote, lit by the baleful glow of the Great Conflagration. Now, as I'm describing these physical locations, you might be thinking back to the start of this video where I said that each of the planes is infinite in size. How can an infinite plane also have edges that overlap with other planes? Well, that brings us to the final part of this video. How to deal with the mind-bending physics, or lack thereof, underpinning the elemental plane of air. With all of the planes, and especially the plane of air, you're going to have to suspend your normal assumptions about physics and realism. For example, there is light here, pouring in great golden shafts between the clouds. But is there a sun? Unclear. There is a sense of up and down in the plane, and if you jump off your airship, you'll fall through the sky. So, does that mean there is gravity emanating from some point below? Unclear. I've heard a lot of different theories that explain space, light, and gravity in the plane of air, and here are my preferred ways to deal with these issues. Not canon, just a few useful workarounds. To make navigation and directions easier, I rule that there are 4 directions in the plane of air in addition to up and down. These directions are inward, outward, fireward, and waterward. Go far enough inward and one will re-enter the material plane. Travel outward to reach a place where the sky is interwoven with the astral plane. Go fireward to reach the elemental plane of fire, and you guessed it, go waterward to reach the elemental plane of water. Up and down are infinite directions, and you can either have that infinity stretch on like an endless tunnel upwards and downwards, or you can make it a kind of loop, where if you fall far enough down, you end up looping back to the top and falling from a place above where you started. This approach allows you to create a setting that can be mapped and navigated by the players without giving up on the important fact that the plane itself is infinite. light. Now, what about sunlight? Again, here is my interpretation. While it might look like sunlight, what the players are actually seeing is beams of light breaking through from the plane of fire. Remember, the plane of fire is right next door to the plane of air, so it makes intuitive sense that light and heat could radiate through portals and rifts in the fabric of the planes and create an effect that looks and feels like the sun. This also means that when navigating the plane of air, the players can always pick their direction based on where the light is coming from. The colder and darker they get, the more they're going waterward, the hotter fireward. These are not perfect solutions, but for most players they'll be more than enough to satisfy any qualms they might have about the underlying rules of the plane. Using this approach, you'll be able to make a map with roads of wind connecting different key locations, clear compass points, and relatively fixed landmarks, while still maintaining the weirdness of the plane's nature and magic. And that's the end of my first elemental planes video. The next one in the series will focus on the elemental plane of Earth. If you're interested in my Wildergrove Kickstarter, head to the link below this video and sign up on the pre-launch page to be notified when we launch, and if you want to support the channel, you can back me over on Patreon. By the way, if any of the individual topics I covered in this video are of interest to you and you want to hear more about them in a dedicated video, for example the Vati, the Dawn War, the Jinn, let me know in the comments below and I'll see if I can make that happen. I'll see you in the next video.